reading it in our gospel, we see examples of both a nation and a religion or a faith that have become unhinged from the truth. In our first reading, we have a very strange story taking place. We have a kingdom and a country that has, again, been severed from sanity. It says, the king goes around basically telling people, you will be killed if you do not eat pork. Now, we should just let that sink in. That is weird. I will kill you if you don't eat bacon. That's odd and insane, right? And we all recognize that. That's crazy. And we see there the insanity that so often happens in societies when things have been cut off from the truth of things. And I think that if we're honest when we look at our own country, and I just want to say right now, I'm not preaching about the election, so you can relax. This is more of a State of the Union address, if you will. But when we look at our own country, right, we see insanity. We see the evidence of things that are insane going on in our nation, right? We see the assault on the elderly, Washington, D.C. just approving physician-assisted suicide, and other states mulling that over. We see the assault on the unborn, the embryos, and even in some states, maybe it's okay to kill those who've just been born if their mom didn't want them. We see assaults on religious freedom, going to jail if you don't bake a cake for a wedding that you don't believe is a wedding. We see people being persecuted. We see people being starved and not let into our country, people who are being persecuted in their homeland, and us saying, sorry, you're not welcome here. We see the ways in which we speak to each other, right, and communicate and talk to one another sounds more like insanity than sane people. Instead of caring for each other, going out and actually serving one another, helping those who need a hand or who are poor, we set up systems to do it for us so that we don't ever have to talk to each other. And these are just some of the assaults. We see them, we know them, we're familiar with them because we live in the midst of them. The things that are very clearly the evidence that our society is straying from the truth upon which it was founded. And when we look at our country, there's something that's very interesting going on there. We need to recognize, right? The United States of America has been described from the beginning by other countries, by the church, by its own founders, as an experiment. And it's a very fascinating experiment. And the experiment was this: can we tie a country together? Can we keep a country and found a country on the truth of things without having it carry a particular religious flag? Because that's all that people had known up to that point, right? Either your country was Catholic, or your country was Lutheran, or your country was Calvinist, whatever it may be, right? So in fact, the United States, as we know, was mostly made up of people who had, at least in the early days, fled persecution of a country that had a particular religious flag, right? So they said, let's try this. Let's see if we can found a country on the truth of things without, again, having them associated with a particular religious flag. And I think the question that we need to ask ourselves is, how is the experiment going? Is it working? Are we still tied to the truth of things upon which all people recognize our country was founded? When you go through the founding fathers, they admit to a person, of all their different religious backgrounds and beliefs, they admit to a person that what we were doing in the United States was exactly that. Founding a country based on the idea or the experiment, can we hold this together? Can we keep it tied to the truth and founded on the truth of things? Can we keep it tied to sanity without having it have a religious denomination attached to it? I'll read you one example. Again, find any of the founding fathers and you will find a similar quote. John Quincy Adams said, "The Declaration of Independence laid the cornerstone of human government upon the first precepts of Christianity." Not Catholicism, not Calvinism, not Lutheranism, but that belief of those things that are shared among the Judeo-Christian tradition. And as we look around, I think we have to recognize that we're struggling to keep things attached to the foundation upon which this experiment was founded. What makes it even more difficult is that a lot of the ways in which this attack on this experiment is taking place is done through the stealing and appropriating of the words that came from that same Christian tradition and founding principles, particularly the notion of rights. Our nation is assaulted by people claiming to have rights and saying that they're just there, when you will never find anyone in the history of the world talking about rights before the Catholic Church. Yeah, sure, the king had rights, or this person had rights, or the nobility had rights, but the Catholic Church stood up and said, every last person has rights, because they were made in the image and likeness of God. You cannot talk about rights without acknowledging where the word comes from or why they're there. And yet we have started to do that, to help tear our country away from the foundations upon which it was built, using words from the foundation upon which it was built. Now, we can get really depressed, and we can sit around and complain. We can talk about all these things, and the world's going to hell in a handbasket, right? But what we need to also recognize, our church says very beautifully and has looked to the United States and has praised it, particularly, I think, when we look at the words of John Paul II. He is a fascinating leader and speaker on the power of democracy in its American form and others, democracy or a democratic republic that we have. Why? Because he suffered under both Nazism and communism. And so he came forward from that experience, that cultural experience in Eastern Europe and in Poland, loving the idea of the American Democratic Republic and hoping to and helping ensure, in fact, as Pope, that system spreading to places where it had not. John Paul II says something very important for us, though. He says that democracy, as we use it and have tried to have it, takes constant vigilance, constant input, us constantly working to help keep things tied together, to keep our systems tied to the truth of things, to the foundation upon which it was built. And so we lie to ourselves the moment we think, oh, woe is us, because our moms or dads or past generations got to just sit back and coast. If they did, then they weren't actually being good citizens in the way that the church puts that forward. If we're going to be good citizens in the way that the church envisions that, in the way in which Christ envisions that, it involves us being active all the time, every day, being vigilant, working to ensure that justice is flourishing, that good works are being done, and that our communities, locally and on the larger scale, are rooted in and stay connected to the truth of things, even if we don't have to call them Catholic or Calvin or Lutheran or Jewish or Muslim or whatever it may be. That's the beauty of our system, and that's what the church is calling us to be active citizens. So if we look around and we see some of the things that are going on and we just hope that they'll go away, or we hope our country will rediscover its foundational principles without us doing anything, we're deceiving ourselves. We are called to be an active citizenry by our church. And what does that look like? We get a beautiful path forward in the second reading when Paul writes to the Thessalonians. Encourage your hearts and strengthen them in every good deed. We get encouraged, and we are called forth, of course, to be people who do good work, who do good deeds, who do acts of love and charity. And that will be the way in which our country stays connected to the foundations upon which it was built, and the insanities that we see around us start to dissipate. And then finally, in the gospel, we see a faith that is untethered from truth. We see the Pharisees, or the Sadducees, come forward, and they ask Jesus this stumper that they think is a stumper, right? 7 brothers, Lord. They all die one after the other, and they each marry They marry a sister-in-law, and they go forward, and they all each marry, and then the next one dies, and then they're like, now, who is the husband of the wife when we all go to heaven? And if I were Jesus, which this is reason 14,200 that I'm not, I would say, who cares? Right? We see like, oh, you're in heaven. Why does it matter? Right? But Jesus is much more pastoral, so Jesus answers the question kindly and talks to them about what happens in heaven. But our faith too, religion can come unchained from the foundations and the truth of things as well. It's important for us to recognize that as well, which is probably one of the reasons that the American experiment sprang up, is because a religion can come unchained from the truth of things, and people can take particular things and particular words from a religion and build something in their own image and likeness. They can go down in the cafeteria and pick out the things that they like and say, this is the new religion that I'm going to follow. The way that we remain rooted in that is by staying connected to the church. Christ said, I will come to you and I choose to be present to you through the church, through the sacraments and through its teaching. And so the way that we are promised to stay sane is to stay in the church, to stay rooted in the church, and to stay faithful. So may we do that, and may we be people who are constantly engaged in works of charity and kindness and love, knowing that when we do that, both our faith and our civil life will grow closer to the truths upon which both are founded.